I've been making a lot of videos and just content on the topic of peaking and predictability going into meet day lately. And this video is going to be similar in that regard, but it's more so going to be emphasizing the fact that oftentimes we need to trial and test things in training in order to be confident that they're going to work when we actually need to put them into practice during the place that matters, which is, for the most part, going to be meet day. So the purpose of this video is really to emphasize that, where specifically when determining which areas that we need to taper and pull back from going into a meet, if any, because oftentimes, some people are going to buy really hard into the whole train into a meet approach, which again, I have another video on exactly what that means and how to orient someone's peaking process around that. But again, the emphasis here is when we are going to pull back in certain areas, if applicable, going into a meet, sometimes it can strip predictability from things, which is the most important thing going into meet day. Will meet day be strong? How do we get it to show up strong? Is the day going to be predictable? Things of that nature. And in order for us to really determine that, there is a decision-making process we can make. TSP Chris has an excellent post on what to essentially remove from a taper and how important it is to keep the higher specificity and higher influence work in the mix throughout the entirety of prep, even throughout the week of a meet, while the more fluff stuff can be removed, like bicep curls, lateral raises, things of that nature. But another way that we can really figure that out and kind of eliminate the question of, okay, what do we need to pull back and how much do we need to pull back in certain areas going into a meet is we can test that in training ahead of time. So essentially the premise here is when we peak for meet day, it's best to trial that in training. Go into meet day and actually go into the time that it matters the most with predictability and with certainty that what we're going to do here for meet week and the areas that we're going to pull back and how much we're going to pull back, if applicable, is going to be done in a way that's predictable. I mentioned actually being able to trial something before putting it into effect in training, especially from a peaking perspective and a tapering and removing intensity, whatever you want to call it, perspective as well. We need to know that it's going to work. And we also need to find out oftentimes if something isn't going to work to figure that out ahead of time before we put it into effect. Obviously, there's going to be times when we try something and it doesn't come into effect as much as we want on the platform, and that's totally fine. But obviously, we would like to eliminate the possibility of that happening, and a good way to do that is essentially just to trial something beforehand. And peaking is a really, really integral part of how to show up the strongest on the platform. So if we essentially figure that out ahead of time, we can just replicate the peaking process that we've trialed in training once or twice going into meet day to heighten predictability as much as possible. So what I mean by that is, say we have someone who's going to be tapering in a certain area, say deadlift, for example, as that one typically holds the most fatigue and gets the biggest performance boost going into meet day when we pull back. Say we have someone on deadlift where we know that their final session is going to be pulled back in some regard, but how much does it need to be pulled back and when does it need to be pulled back, things like that. A good idea is to trial that in training. If you have a shortened block, which in my opinion is a great opportunity to do this, and that's why I'm going to show 3 examples here to get to that point. But if you have a shortened block, or if you have, a block that's far away from meet day where you have an opportunity to experiment, then those are both excellent opportunities to literally trial the exact same peaking process in training that you're going to hypothetically run on meet day. So again, I have 3 examples here. I'm going to show kind of my thought process behind what I did for these 3 individuals to kind of trial a little bit of a taper, and that didn't leave us questioning, okay, how much do we need to pull back? Where do we need to pull back from going into meet day? First example I have here is one of my guys, Travis, where for his last meet back in November, we had a little bit of an awkward adjustment that we needed to make to his block and overall timing of blocks going into meet day. So in order for us to line things up, the peaking strategy we take for Travis is we do an additional taper week. We don't have a true retrain into the meat approach for him, and this has worked pretty solid so far. So for him, again, we had a little bit of an awkward layout of block structure and block timing going into meet day. He competed on November 23rd of last year, and what we did to start orienting his blocks around meet day was we started timing things out in early September. I think I actually did this a block before, but just for the sake of this video in terms of what's relevant, starting from September 1st to November 23rd, if we wanted to time his blocks going to meet day, we run 4-week blocks, and then we needed to leave room for this additional taper week. So what the best option was to line things up was to do a 3-week block. So that would end on the 21st of September, his usual 4-week block after that, another usual 4-week block after that, and then a taper week, and that's perfect timing. So what I wanted to do was I took this 3-week block that we had off the bat to kind of start prep off, and I said, okay, let's experiment a little bit with a bit more of an aggressive peaking approach, see if that works in training, so we have a yes or no answer of if we should stick with this or not going into the final block of prep in terms of what we need to pull back on and how much we need to taper from, and just see how that works in training and see if we can replicate that if it works well on meet day. So what I did, and I've made a few like story posts on this on Instagram as well, because I find this is a really excellent way to make good use of the shortened block, for example, so he's got 3 weeks here, okay? We've got week 1, and I'm going to specifically reference, I think it was only deadlift we did this on. Oh, okay, so it was actually squat and deadlift, awesome. So even better of an example. But so for deadlift, what we did was, for both lifts, I'll just explain both lifts. Week 1 was essentially the taper. Okay, so that week 1 was like a little bit easier than his usual week 1. Really pulling back on areas that I was confident would inflate performance going to next week. Week 2 would be kind of like that test, like, okay, let's lift the heavy stuff on this week and see how it goes after we pull back big time the previous week. And then this final week, before he ramps back into a normal 4-week block, like I mentioned, we did essentially a deload week. So essentially like a week 0 intro week, whatever you want to call it, to recover from all the heavy stuff he was doing the week prior. So in a 3-week block, you can kind of view it as really easy taper week, testing week, like a heavy week, as in let's have some indicator sets and see how the week prior actually influenced this week, and then a deload afterwards. So let's reference squat and deadlift here. For week 1, which was that taper, he has a really, really easy single on deadlift. It was supposed to be at 5 to 6. He rated it at 4 RPE. So again, really, really easy. The week after, boom, all the way to an 8.5 to 9 single. And then he hit a PR at 222.5 the week after, pretty much replicating the week 1, just having it be a little bit easier to make sure he's coming in really, really recovered for the normalcy of having a 4-week block after that. Same thing for squat. His squat layout usually is like a rep set followed by another rep set, and then 4s to 5s for back off sets. So he, we had this really, really easy squat single, and then we went into another all-time PR on squat. I think this was a 5 kilo all-time PR at that point, or no, 2.5 to 5 kilo all-time PR just the week after, and then boom, another really, really easy week on squat to wrap up this little mini 3-week block. So what we concluded here was, okay, we can pull back and things will go well and performance will inflate, and he has a really good response to this larger scale reduction in intensity. So we trialed that, essentially just mimicked that as closely as we possibly could going into meet day, and that worked out super nicely. Another quick one that I'm going to run over is pretty similar to Travis, where for Adriana, what I did for her was something almost identical. And her last meet was in December, and we had another awkward 3-week period that we needed to do something productive with, essentially, and maximize the outcome of that. So we weren't like rushing pacing during that period or anything like that. And with me seeing success doing this in the past, and us also at the time for her, we were doing an additional taper week as that peaking strategy. However, now for her, we've switched up the overall general approach there. But for this specific meet, we did tack on an additional taper week, and you can kind of see the theme in these examples here. But What we did for her was, again, something pretty identical. So she had a little bit of an awkward timing going into her last meet on December 14th. So it didn't work out super conveniently where we could do 3 or 4 5 week blocks in a row and have that work out perfectly going into meet day. So we did have another awkward 3 week period to do something with. So, like I mentioned, we did pretty much the exact same thing. Where week 1, I'm going to mainly reference squat here. Not entirely, I don't remember if we did this on deadlift too. Deadlift looks like we did too. Okay, cool. So it's both lifts. But on squat here, we essentially had what you can view as the taper, where that was a big pullback in intensity, a bit easier than her typical week 1. Same deal on deadlift, a bit easier than her typical week 1, very, very, very easy overall. And then the week after was the test week. Like that was like, okay, here we are. Essentially, the purpose of this week is to take indicator sets and see if that actually worked. And it did. So we have a general idea of, okay, what areas do we need to pull back from here to get a certain lift to show up, if we need to pull back at all. A good idea to do this with as well is with bench, as a lot of people don't really need a pullback on bench. You can kind of have a bit more of that truer training in approach on bench specifically, where I don't think I have really many people at all that I do this larger scale taper for on bench. So if you are curious if something works for an athlete or not, or yourself or whoever, mainly on bench, because again, I think that can go more one of two ways as opposed to something like a deadlift, where most people are going to be stronger after pulling back for the short term. Applying bench to this strategy is a really good way to do things. But you can see the overall theme here. We're testing a peaking approach in prep before we put it into practice going into meet day. For my final example, this will be a little bit quicker because for Travis and Adriana, we did both squat and deadlift. But for Sophia, when we applied this this overall strategy, we only did it for her on deadlift, knowing that she needs a lot of intensity and stimulus overall for squat to come in strong. So we didn't really bother applying like this tapering or testing strategy on squat. It was more so a deadlift thing that we needed to figure out. How much to pull back mainly was the question for her, because Sophia is the type of lifter where everything needs to stay in, like volume, intensity, stimulus, work in general needs to be high, and we need to not lose that in order for her to be at her strongest. However, we have seen success pulling back on deadlift for her. Like, she's a fairly extended conventional deadlift puller, and she holds a fair amount of fatigue on deadlift relative to others. So we do know that the work and the intensity drives the progress in the long term, and that's what's important for progress and whatnot. But similar to how Chris has phrased this in his Instagram post that I mentioned in the beginning of this video, it's not something we necessarily need to keep in for her for meet day. So again, the main question for her was, we know that there is a pullback needed. It's just more so how much of a pullback is needed to get the desired outcome. So for her, we kind of timed things for her next meet pretty immediately after she competed at the previous meet. So she competed in September, and then I had timing going into her next meet organized pretty much immediately. And the way I had things written out was, for her, like I mentioned, we do a truer training into the meet approach for her besides deadlift. So it's kind of like, okay, we know that deadlift needs to taper something, just how much of that exactly do we need to taper. So for her, we did, again, we were left with a little bit of an awkward shorter block here that we needed to do something productive with before we time the remainder of prep into meet day. So she had, to recap, a 3-week block here, and then 3 4-week blocks going into meet day. She normally runs a 4-week block, so we wanted to make sure those were as close to meet day as possible. But again, the awkward period that we needed to do something with in order to line everything up perfectly was, we had this 3-week block essentially just hanging around. So knowing that it was only deadlift we wanted to experiment and trial around, and knowing that we had specifically 3 weeks to do that experimenting within, also ignore the purple. Sophia likes to highlight things with purple. But what we did, there we go. was she was specifically on doubles for this block, and that was kind of like just the point of what rep set we were running on her primary session during this block. So for week 1, we essentially didn't do anything overly crazy. Like, we kept this a normal week 1 for her, and then coming to her secondary session, we pulled back a bit more than usual. This was about 15, 20 kilos lighter than usual for this day, and about half of the volume that she usually has on this day. So pretty much like a really, really big pullback here, but it's not like we're only doing a single or only doing one set or just not doing a session in general or something really, really larger scale like that. But we did have a bigger pullback, much bigger pullback than usual, right? So 2 sessions that were pulled back coming into Saturday, she hits a double PR. She's 190 for 2, which is 5 kilos under her 1 max. So overall, safe to say, we got a good glimpse of what needed to be pulled back the preceding session. I will admit we did have a little bit of a confound with doing 2 sessions as a pullback here, because if we were to normally train into the meet for her, the session 1 week before the week that we need to show up strong would be much heavier than this, like a fair amount. But that's why we didn't overly pull back on this week 1 session, is to eliminate the confound of that happening. But again, what we drew from this was, okay, this is roughly how much we need to pull back for you to get the desired effect and get her to show up as strong as possible when we need her to. And then going into a meet when we need this to show up strong. The prep specifically for this timing was a bit of a qualifier meet. But either way, we just needed to essentially trial that, and now we have the data to apply that in practice. Like I mentioned, the overall theme is before you put something into practice, trial it in training, especially when we're talking about meet day and overall peaking, which is kind of a one and done situation. It's not like you can have another shot at peaking into the same meet. It's just you got to nail it as much as you can and get that specific meet to show up as best as you possibly can. So keeping that in mind, the experimenting and the trialing of, okay, we're going to peak, planning to peak this way into meet day. Let's get that under our belts in training ahead of time to see if it actually works. In my opinion, that's a really, really useful thing to do. And this overall video was a couple a bit larger scale examples where we pull back big time and then have kind of like a testing indicator week where it doesn't necessarily need to be as large scale as I was showing in these examples. For example, you can do something as simple as, let's see if we can remove, a few bench accessories or tricep accessories maybe, going into someone's final primary bench session of the block and see if that inflates performance, or pull back on a certain squat session and see if that inflates performance on a certain primary session. So there are these many ways that you can experiment a little bit with pulling back intensity in certain areas or volume or whatever an athlete may need, and just kind of have a trialing taper procedure in training to see if that works and kind of get the data that you might need to mimic that going into a meet. So as always, if you liked this video and felt like you learned something here or benefited from what I presented with these 3 case studies, then definitely drop a comment with any questions that you might have, and I'll see you at the next video.